Long days, pleasant nights, and welcome to Kingslingers, a Doof media podcast journeying through Stephen King's Dark Tower series and beyond. I am your host, Constant Reader Scott Daly, and chasing me around with a grocery cart, as always, it's my good friend Matt Freeman.
Everybody loves a little good-natured ramming with a grocery cart.
Until I send you one of my special little letters, Matt.
Oh no, I don't deserve that. Oh, I'm dead.
This week on the show, we are covering another one of our Stephen King short stories. We're going to be covering his 2002 short story, Everything's Eventual, which, Matt, as you now know, is the story of our good friend and breaker extraordinaire, Dinky Earnshaw. We're back with good old Dink.
That's right. This was a pleasant surprise. I had no idea. It's always fun when you manage to not be spoiled on something, and then you're like, I recognize that name.
Yeah, it's the power of actually you just forgetting that I told you back in Dark Tower 7 that there's a story about Dinky called Everything's Eventual, and you just forgot about it, but that's okay.
Yeah. No, it really is. It has been a blessing doing these shows with you, that I don't remember things because, like, when we're in the opposite position, and when I was the first time reader, when I was the diehard fan and you were the first time reader with Worm, you would have like theories, and I'd be like, yeah, maybe that's what happens.
And everyone would be like, wow, you're having such a good poker face there, Matt.
Yeah.
When you just didn't remember.
I just didn't remember that well.
Yeah. Remember. Yeah. It's all in good fun.
Yeah.
All right. Do you want to just get right into it, Matt? I don't know. This is kind of, it's just a one-off episode. We're covering a whole short story in one go. We don't normally do stuff like this, but I felt like this was one we had to talk about for sure.
Yeah. I agree. Let's just get into it. It's definitely very Dark Tower connected, but it is just like you said, kind of standalone, fairly short, bite-sized story. So
yeah, and as I've said many times, Stephen King short fiction is some of my favorite stuff in the world. So I hope you enjoyed this one.
I did.
All right, Matt. Everything's Eventual, the short story, not the collection, was first released in the October-November issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction, which puts it on our Dark Tower timeline. It comes out about exactly the same time as Wizard and Glass. I think Wizard and Glass was published in 1997. I forgot to say 97. The October-November 97 issue of the Magazine of Fantasy and Science Fiction.
Okay.
So yeah, Wizard and Glass came out in November of that year. So it was about the exact same time Wizard and Glass is coming out. It was eventually included in the 14 short story collection, which was given the name of this story that also featured the Little Sisters of Eloria that we read before. This came out in 2002. So this is still 1 year removed from King's sprint to the Dark Tower finish line. And I think this is one of those stories, and maybe you disagree with me, but this is one of those stories that didn't start out being a Dark Tower story, that retroactively became a Dark Tower story, because I really don't think that there's anything in this that definitively says we're talking about the Crimson King and the Low Man and his people.
Yeah, in fact, the names that we do here are not names that ever show up in the Dark Tower.
Yeah.
So I guess that's some evidence that you're right about that. It'll be interesting as we go. Maybe there will be things that contradict that view, but I lean toward agreeing with you.
Yeah, so this tells the story of Dinky Earnshaw, as we said, is a name that we should recognize as one of our trinity of breakers who assisted Roland and his quartet when they got to Blue Heaven. Of course, the other two being Ted Brodigan from our last story, and poor old Sheemy. Poor old Sheemy.
Yeah, it's very interesting now to realize how much attention King paid to all of the breakers, like as characters, gave all of our breakers whole backstories.
Yeah, I think we're going to kind of get into this throughout the story, but one of the things King started doing very early in his career and continued doing was this idea that there's this secret organization out there that is collecting psychically powered, shining powered, touch powered people and children, and recruiting them, taking them under their wing, and then using them for nefarious purposes. Like the book Firestarter is basically all about this. There's a child who is Drew Barrymore plays her in the movie, but she's pyrokinetic, and there's the organization in that is named the Shop. And so there's another organization in this one, and kind of what Algol Ciento did was kind of take that concept that King had been toying with for years and years and years and bring that into the Dark Tower. So now it's not just these shady, possibly government organizations, but it's something beyond all of that stuff. Again, none of that's in here.
So that's cool to know. I didn't quite understand that was like a big thing in the rest of his fiction. So that's good for me to know.
So we haven't read a lot of Stephen King short fiction. So one of the things that he does in his collections sometimes is include little blurbs at the beginning or end of the story to explain, the how or the why he wrote this particular little short story. And Everything's Eventual starts with one as well, which I think is worth us reading and talking about. It begins with, "One day, out of nowhere, I had a clear image of a young man pouring change into a sewer grating outside of a small suburban house in which he lived. I had nothing else, but the image was so clear and so disturbingly odd that I had to write a story about it. It came out smoothly and without a single hesitation, supporting my idea that stories are artifacts, not really made things, which we create and can take credit for, but pre-existing objects which we dig up." So it's a fun little opening, right?
Yeah, that is very fun. It reminds me like of where my story ideas come from, which is usually random flashes of imagery and emotion that I then try to build a story around. Although normally the stories don't pour out of me the way King describes here. But I will say that the method of starting with some kind of pseudo Jungian image bubbling up from the subconscious is much more likely to result in a good final story relative to like sitting down with a blank sheet of paper and just trying to sort of construct a story idea from whole cloth.
Yeah.
But yeah, it was familiar to me, except for the part about how the story just poured out of him. That almost never happens.
Yeah, and I love the idea that like this odd event, this kid just pouring change down a sewer grating. It is part of the story, but it's so funny that was the jumping off point, because that's a throwaway reference that we don't actually get to see. Dinky just references it once. He actually, in the story proper, spends more time talking about the experience of throwing dollar bills down the garbage disposal than he does throwing change down the sewer grating, except for his random, like, someday some sewer guy is going to come down there to clog it and unclog it and win the lottery. But I think it's so weird that was the impetus for this whole thing, and it's just kind of a throwaway gag and that he just moves on from really quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. Just clearly he follows the muse wherever it leads.
Yeah. And I mean, like, you can just tell, like, he has this idea. Like, I think it's fun to really just think about where his mental process must have gone, right? Because he has, okay, so why would a kid be pouring change down a sewer grating? Okay, maybe someone told him to. Okay, Who would do that though? His boss? Well, why would he do that? And then you can just slowly kind of build, and suddenly you've got this whole evil organization that's controlling this psychic murderer.
Yeah, this whole scenario just springs from that image.
Yeah, it's wild. So our story begins, and we see immediately that it is a first-person story, and we'll learn by the end of the story that it's actually not only first-person, but it's actually an epistolary. We are reading the written-out confession of Dinky Earnshaw, and what I love about this is that, like him, the story itself is kind of out of order, and not totally collected. We get, like, he constantly hints and gestures towards things that he hasn't actually explained to us yet, and then has to like go back. It's kind of taking King's natural tendency to tell you what's coming and making it, giving it a Watsonian reason to do it, right? I think there's this part that begins, "This is what comes of leaving school without a diploma," Ma would say during my delivery dance stint, "and you've got this to look forward to for the rest of your life." Good old Ma, on and on, until I actually thought about writing her one of those special letters. And at this point, we have no idea. He's like referencing a thing that, as if we should know, but we don't. And I love this because, yeah, like I said, it allows King to do this thing that he's always doing, but he gives it, maybe for the first time, a Watsonian reason. Like, there's always this weird thing he does in a lot of his third person stories where the narrator will just suddenly grab control of the story and be like, "And now I am going to tell you what's going to happen next." But in this story, because of the epistolary style, like, it makes sense. It makes sense for Dinky to kind of be going a little bit out of order here.
Yeah, definitely. The other cool thing about the epistolary style, to me, is that the voice actor, Justin Long, as we discussed last time, is able to sort of perform the reading as a confession, and that really elevates the experience. Like, so it's not just actor reading, book; it's actor performing confession, and I enjoyed that. But yeah, I like what you said about the built-in explanation for why Dinky is being cagey with this information.
Yeah. Well, and that's the other thing too, is you kind of realize that it's because he doesn't want to reveal it. Why does he gesture towards what happened to Skipper 6 times before he actually says what happened to Skipper? Because he's ashamed of it and he doesn't want to talk about it until he absolutely has to.
And a lot of what he's doing, we'll get to some examples of it as we go, but a lot of what he's doing is sort of almost trying to convince you, the listener, the reader, or convince himself that what he did was, if not justified, then at least understandable. And we'll get there.
Yeah, definitely. And just as a final note on Justin Long, I listened to this one too out of curiosity because Justin Long, and yeah, I thought he did a really good job. I thought he was a good pick for this. Like, Dinky seems like that. He seems like he has the right voice for the type of person Dinky Earnshaw is, and I thought he did great.
Yeah, I agree.
I really love this opening paragraph of the whole story, though. I think it does a lot of interesting things. I've got a good job now, and no reason to feel glum. No more hanging out with the Gumby heads at Super Saver, policing up the cart corral and getting bothered by assholes like Skipper. Skipper's munching the old dirt sandwich these days. But one thing I have learned in my 19 years on this planet is don't relax. There are Skippers everywhere. There's so much here, right? Like, I know Dinky is only 19 years old, and maybe it's just because we're just coming off of reading it, but I found a lot in the story and a lot in Dinky Earnshaw that related back to Low Men in Yellow Coats to me. Like, he's similar to young Bobby Garfield in a lot of ways, and it's really fascinating because, like, Bobby got Ted Brodigan, who didn't make his life perfect, but certainly helped him along the way, whereas Dinky gets Mr. Sharpton, who is not comparable at all.
Yeah, I mean, interestingly, kind of physically similar in that he's an old man, and he provides a certain kind of comfort to our lonely Dinky. But yeah, I think Dinky's being young, his youth serves as a maybe a partial excuse for what he does in the story, particularly to Skipper, where he doesn't even really seem to understand fully what he has done, or maybe doesn't seem to like believe that doesn't seem to have believed that he could really do that before he did it, but now he feels horribly guilty about it, obviously.
Yeah.
And this is one thing that's fun about this story is because the whole thing is written in Dinky Earnshaw's voice, very firmly in character, just like that paragraph you just read, where we have all these sayings throughout, like munching on the old dirt sandwich these days. That's just absolutely written throughout the whole story. These little Dinkyisms.
King's having a lot of fun with these sayings. I mean, just the saying everything's eventual in and of itself is King having fun. But yeah, I think he's really enjoying writing in Dinky's voice, which is very different and young and kind of sarcastic and jokey. And I like it. I like the voice. I like the tone of the short story. It feels very King, while also you can see he's reaching slightly for a different kind of voice.
Yeah, absolutely.
So Dinky tells us the details of his job before getting around to what the job actually is. We learn all the benefits and the pay of it first. And we learn that he doesn't actually get paid much, but they did give him a house. And then we get where our title comes from. Mostly, I just stay here. It's only got 1 bedroom, but it's still an excellent house. Eventual, as Pug used to say. He was the one guy at the Super Saver I liked. When he wanted to say something was really good, Pug never say it was awesome like most people do. He'd say it was eventual. How funny is that? The old Pugmeister. I wonder how he's doing. So here's where our title comes from. And I'm curious what your thoughts on this title were before you had eventual defined in the context of the story. And I think this is one of the fun things King is doing here, because we have this meaning. It just means like excellent. It means awesome. But also eventual is a word that has its own meaning as well. And you can kind of say it meaning the contextual reference while also playing off the true meaning of the word as well.
Yeah, I mean, the first thing that I thought, maybe not the first thing, but the literal meaning the literal interpretation of everything is eventual is a sort of fatalistic statement. It's like everything is fated, or as Roland Deschain would say, Ka. Which is interesting. And I don't know what that has to do with the themes of the story, but it's I guess maybe this story could be said to have a theme of fate. I don't know.
I mean, I think fate possibly, but I think one of the big things about this story to me is this idea of arrested development, that this is a adult. He's 19 years old, which is funny, of course, because Stephen King. This is before Wolves of the Calla came out, so this is before he was really starting to play with 19. But anyway, he's 19 years old, and he hasn't really done anything. He's not really grown up. He was living at home before this opportunity came on. And just to have this idea that everything's eventual, which means, eventually something's going to happen. Like something's it's this very passive view of the world, which is, I think, what Dinky kind of had. And just like he is kind of a character that like just reacts and is not even clear in what he wants. Like, what does he want out of life? What does he want out of friendship? What does he want out of relationships? What he doesn't know, and he hasn't really thought about any of it. And so it's just like this kind of, everything's, I don't know, man, everything's eventual. I don't have to worry about it,
which goes really well with the idea that he gets this job that's like the ultimate dead-end job. Like it's almost perfectly crafted to be the perfect dead-end job, where it's like you're technically taken care of, your basic needs are taken care of, but you can never aspire to anything higher than what you're doing. There's no promotion, there's no saving up for retirement, there's no, it's just, you're just sitting in a box and doing a job and getting paid, and not, again, enough to live somewhat comfortably, but not really have aspirations. You're just in this perfect holding pattern, which goes really well with that what you just said.
And you're still not really being a functional adult either, because like you don't cook for yourself, you don't clean for yourself, you don't do anything. Like, he doesn't have friends. He's like, his existence, you're right, is perfectly manicured to make sure he's just stuck. And that as the story explicitly states later, as Dinky figures it out, that's the point. The point is to make it so he can't do anything. But we learn here that his pay, such as it is an envelope appearing every Thursday in his mail slot while he's watching As the World Turns. Which is such a weird, like, you're watching, like, he's 19 years old. He's got his whole life ahead of him, and he's just hanging out on the couch watching soap operas. It's a hilarious detail that I love.
Yeah, absolutely. I guess I didn't consciously register a lot of these details, but it is funny how much of it kind of clicks together to show you how totally given up this character is. He's completely surrendered. It's funny because I didn't consciously register that this was supposed to take place like roughly around the year 2000. $70 for a week is not a lot of money in the year 2000.
No,
I remember the year 2000 well enough to know that. So the fact that he feels comfortable, it's like, well, you only feel comfortable because you're 19 years old and you're used to having no money. But like, this is not exactly living it up. It's just funny because he kind of speaks as though like, this is a pretty sweet gig, huh? $70 a week. And it's like, no.
Yeah, he says it's 2 weeks tips at his dead end pizza job, which is like when you're making 2 weeks tips in 1 week, that's suddenly the most amazing thing ever. But yeah, you're right, it's nothing. And I mean, it's interesting, like $70, you kind of wonder why 70. That's a very specific number. I mean, it comes out to $10 a day, which like even in the late 90s, like if you got a stipend while you were traveling from your company of $10 a day, you'd be like, man, this is bullshit. That's not enough money.
Right. I can buy one meal a day. Great.
Yeah. And it I mean, yeah, even depending where you're, like if you're traveling New York City, not even.
Yeah. Right.
It's really interesting because like, I love the detail with which King has him describe item by item how he spends his $70 a week, right? That like he goes out, he 3 nights a week he'll go to McDonald's and get some stuff. 1 night a week he'll do a fancy meal that'll cost him $24. He goes to the movies twice a week. He gets porn mags a couple times, and he just kind of adds up, and he's like, yeah, by the end of the week I got like $8 left. And then I just toss that down the drain, literally. And there's almost no embarrassment to how he's describing this existence, because I don't think Dinky is even aware enough to be embarrassed by this kind of life.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's a fairly massive lack of self-awareness. I mean, I think that's another thing that pervades throughout this whole thing is he is constantly avoiding self-awareness. Like that's the function of this journal is you only realize, we haven't even gotten there yet because he wrote the thing backwards basically, but you realize eventually like, oh, he has had a crisis. He has realized that there's a need for introspection. He has no capacity for introspection because of his character. You know, he's avoided it his whole life, and then also he's done terrible things that he doesn't want to think about.
Yeah,
and so he's forcing himself to think about these things, maybe for the first time. And so you're right. Yeah, he doesn't have any real embarrassment about it, or if he does, it's a sort of like, well, what are you gonna do? You know?
Yeah. I love this little detail here as well, where he's talking about how he has to go buy his own porno magazines because it's the one thing that if he writes it on his day board, they won't buy for him, which is, I've never actually thought about like the why of that, right? Like why for this evil company that's having him murder people, is it like, is just a Playboy a bridge too far, you know?
That's one of my favorite details of this whole story, to be honest, is because it's like, we don't know who these, you know, people are, right? Mm-hmm. It's like, are these, they're probably not Cantoy, like that this seems like a bit of a low tier job for the low men to be doing. They're probably some just employees.
Yeah,
I don't know. It's such an evocative detail where I think I like had to like pause the story and be like, okay, why wouldn't they, out of all of the things, you know, they'll get him much more ridiculous things, but they won't get him a porno magazine.
Yeah, I mean, I kind of want to explore the whole concept of sex as it relates to the story, which is something we talk about quite a lot in these episodes. But I want to wait till we get to something else. But it is, I mean, this does introduce a pretty interesting wrinkle in that whole thing. They don't let him get pornos, or they make him buy them themselves. They don't let him call sex hotlines. They block the websites on his computer, so he can't even go. Like, I don't think in the 90s there were as much porn online as there is now, but like even the stuff that there was, he can't get to. But yeah, which is just odd.
Maybe, I mean, this is a little bit more kind of theory crafty than I necessarily was thinking at first, but it could be the implication is like, if you use up your sex energy, then you have used up your psychic energy, like that those come from the same pool.
Yeah, but they're not stopping him from getting the magazines. Like he can jerk it all he wants, which he does.
I mean, maybe they just know that they would be unsuccessful, or that would be a bridge too far.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know. He also kind of mentions that he just doesn't have much of a sex drive, and that almost makes me think like, well, I mean, again, I'm getting kind of galaxy brain here, but maybe they're either drugging him, or like part of the hypnosis was to just tamp down his libido so that his psychic powers would come on more strongly or something.
Yeah, I mean, we're going out of order here, and I almost don't even care, because I think you're absolutely right that he mentions a little bit later. He says, in my experience, thinking about sex is like scratching poison ivy. You only spread it around. Besides, sex is no big deal, at least for me. It's there, but it isn't eventual. Which is, I mean, yeah, like, and it's not that he doesn't have, it's not that he doesn't get horny or have urges, because he certainly does. Like, actually, the moment where he decides to go out to get a magazine is when he sees the picture of the man he killed in the paper and starts his discovery. The reason that happens is because he got horny. And so it's not like that's not happening to him, but it's part of this whole complex relationship with, I think, Dinky and actual socialization and friendship and people, which he is not good with. And so he's very comfortable with sex, or anything to do with sex, being just the solo act, you know, being me and my hand and a magazine. But the idea of like being in a relationship with other people. And it's not that it's not something he needs. I don't think he knows how to be around other people. And I think like we learned that he dropped out of high school with 3 weeks left to graduate because not because he was failing, but I think Sharpton just says, cause you were different and you weren't getting along with people. And you like, he's just alone in the world kind of. And that's like something we learn in Algo Ciento, that all the breakers are kind of these people that have been ostracized by society, either directly by people or them kind of choosing to do it to themselves. And Dinky certainly seems to be the poster child of that, is that he just doesn't fit in anywhere. And so anything to do with sex that is not the me and myself act is something that he just can't process or doesn't care to.
Yeah, I agree that there's more on this later, but just the idea that he's this loner and incredibly lonely person, and it's kind of a terribly tragic combination of like, not like he seems to wish that there were other people, you know, like he thinks about his old friend Pug fondly, and he clearly misses him. But I think he's just had so many bad experiences with people that he just expects them to kick him in the nuts. And so it's like, why bother? Why bother? You know, why bother trying to have a real sexual relationship when I'm, you know, it would probably be just disappointing. So I'll just get the magazine or this signed autograph of Nicole Kidman.
Yeah. I also like the idea that sex isn't eventual, you know, again, in our double meaning thing, that like it's not awesome in that meaning, but also it's not something that it's actually something you got to work for. It's not something that's just fated to happen. You're going to have to actually make a decision. You're going to actually go out there and talk to another human being if you want to actually have it.
It's true. Yeah.
It's not eventual, man.
It's not eventual.
So we learn about Dinky's dayboard, which is his other perk, a whiteboard in which we've already kind of talked about this. He can write anything he wants on it. He tests this by writing a Rembrandt painting, and they give him one. It's just a copy, but they also give him a signed autograph from Nicole Kidman, personalized to him. And I mean, do you think that's fake? Because Dinky's convinced it's real.
That's an interesting question. I assumed that it was real because I just kind of assumed, okay, so this is my headcanon for like what's going on behind the scenes, is they've got a whole bunch of other psychics who are dealing with stuff behind the scenes, and we're sort of privy to some of it, and we're sort of hinted at some of it, and then some of it we're just left to imagine. And the idea that you could get a signed autograph from Nicole Kidman if you had a bunch of psychics on your payroll doesn't seem that far-fetched. Now, the question is, if he just wrote something roughly that outlandish every week, would they keep doing that? Like, is that the kind of resources they have, or is this a one-off? Or like I think you're implying, is he just kind of a dumb kid and they've just faked it? And
yeah, you just get someone to write to Dinky, love Nicole Kidman, and okay, it's real. Yeah. I mean, it's fascinating though, because like, you're right. Like, this whole operation seems really interesting. Like, first of all, they're hilariously cheap, which I think is again another throwback to Low Men in Yellow Coats, because we see the low men pay $300 to get Ted Brodigan back, which is just this weird amount of money considering like he's key to their plan to destroy the entire universe. Like, why not just give her $1 million? What the fuck does it matter? What's $300?
Isn't this a thing that's mentioned in the Dark Tower too, where it's like
it is.
One of the bad guys is like just stunned at how cheap they are. Which that's great. I love it.
So yeah, they're not going to shell out more than $70 a week and, you know, a cheap house in Columbus for this guy who's doing incredibly important work for them. So it just seems weird. It just seems like a weird setup. And I think you're right that he feels this level of freedom here, but he's obviously being monitored constantly. It's like probably everyone in this town. I mean, who fucking knows? It could be another like just Algo Ciento type town where it's just a fake town set up somewhere where everyone in there is just working for the company, and he just thinks he's, you know, going out and living life, and it's all bullshit.
Yeah, we know so little details about it, and he only seems to go to like you said, like 3 or 4 locations in a fairly predictable cycle. So for all we know, that could be the case.
Yeah, I mean, the thing, if that was true, they probably would not have let the newspaper with. But I mean, maybe that's part of their plan too, because I mean, that's we're going so out of order. This is what happens. This is what happens when it's a short story where you have all the information in front of you. You just want to jump around like crazy. But like, we don't actually know how he gets to Algol Santio at the end, right?
Yeah.
So maybe this was all part of the plan to transition him to his new job. I don't know.
Yeah, maybe. I mean, he's telling the story kind of in inverse order, so it's not our fault. The thing about the Nicole Kidman autograph, like he spends, okay, yes, this is why he's telling the story backwards, though, right? He's slowly building us up, or himself up, by persuading, like, how, don't you see what a great deal this is? Like, I get the money, I get the Nicole Kidman poster. I they don't give me the porno mags, but I can buy my own porno mag. It's not a big deal, So how could you turn all this cool stuff down? Like, this is the life. Surely you can understand that a person would do pretty much anything for this cool stuff. And like, this is before he's gotten to what they've actually asked him to do, obviously, and how he got here. But it's like, this is the justifying part of the story.
You're absolutely right. Lead with the perks and then slide in the detail of the job second, because that's the part you're actually embarrassed about. Like, and it's actually it's funny, because I think he's doing it because he's trying to convince him, but actually what it does is have the opposite effect, because he kind of slowly dismantles how good the perks actually are by the time he's actually saying, oh yeah, and I'm murdering people. That's what I do.
Right.
I love the structure of this. I really do.
Yeah.
Dinky continues with his out of order story, still listing off his perks, including the cleaners that come and clean for him, and how he goes out into towns and wanders around. And importantly, again, we're going to say not socializing. He doesn't have any friends. He's not trying to make friends. He's not trying to talk to people. Like, no one's stopping him from like getting to know people in town. He's got a pretty set schedule. He could probably see the same people around on the set schedule, but he's not really reaching out to them. And yeah, like you said, the only person in his life that we have any sense of fondness for is good old Pug. And I love this line here. I sort of miss Pug. I wish I could call him, just shoot the shit, tell him some of the stuff that's been going on, like about that guy Neff, for instance. Oh well, spit in the ocean and see if it comes back. It's resigned, man. It's eventual, like it's sad. It's really sad.
Yeah, I like that. Dinky, like I said a minute ago, he's this super lonely person. He's really unable to reach out to people. We really only basically hear about three people. His mom, who all we know about her is she's hypercritical of him to the point where he sometimes fantasizes about murdering her. Pug, who's his only friend, and Skipper, who bullies him. And then eventually the bad guys come in and scoop him up. So that would be a fourth, but I'm talking about like his pre-enlistment life. Yeah. It's like, he's never had any friends. It seems like most of his relationships with people have been bad and net negative. And, when you get to like the dog and stuff, you get there's this pervasive sense that like he just sees the world as a scary place. And he'd rather just stay home and, shut the blinds and watch as the world turns.
Yeah, and there's a real sense, I don't know, like, I'm trying to latch this onto maybe what King was commenting on things he was seeing in real life, right? I'm trying to remember if there's this idea. I think this is almost more fitting to now than it was to the late 90s, early 2000s, right? This idea of perpetual childhood, of arrested development, of stuck inside, before there was a quarantine making you do it, but not going outside, not socializing. Like, these are things that I don't know, maybe pop culture was starting to push this as the video game revolution was coming on. It was like much more like one of the boogeymen of the late 90s was disaffected men in the state of arrested development that aren't going to actually accomplish anything, Yeah,
I mean, I hear what you're saying. It is interesting that there's no, he doesn't even have a game system. He's literally just watching TV. So it's not a direct, like, this guy is a gamer shut in type.
Is Dinky a future incel? I guess that's where I'm gesturing towards.
I mean, I don't think so, because he specifically doesn't think sex is eventual. He doesn't care about
That's
it.
true. That's true.
Instead of, he's more of a hikikomori.
Oh, I'm sorry. A what?
It's the Japanese word for a person who stays in all day and watches TV and plays video games. Yeah. I said it wrong also, so sorry about that.
I mean, but does he not call sex eventual because he really doesn't want it, or just because he doesn't think he'll get it?
Yes. No, I mean, I think that's the kind of trap that a young man can get into, is like, I think he's so utterly hopeless about the idea that it could ever happen that he has decided that he doesn't care about it.
Sure. Yeah, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely right. So this next part, I really just want to highlight how good the writing is sometimes, and King's really clever turns of phrases here, because Dinky is talking about how after the cleaners come in and clean his entire house, it reeks of lemon pledge. And he says, sometimes it's so bad I have these sneezing fits. It's not an allergy, more like a nasal protest demonstration, which is just, I don't know. That's just, I love it. I love it.
Yeah. I love it too.
So finally, Dinky goes back to where he probably should have started the story, which is how he got this job. Turns out it just landed in his lap when Mr. Sharpton called him up, asking him to meet at the Super Saver where he worked. And we see that Dinky is suddenly afraid here, and it's something to do with Skipper again. He's kind of hiding what, but he's convinced that Mr. Sharpton knows what he did to Skipper, which is of course really accurate. But we get this little bit here that I think is worth talking about. There are two kinds of scared. At least that's my theory. There's TV scared and there's real scared. I think we go through most of our lives only getting TV scared, like when we're waiting for our blood test to come back from the doctor, or when we're walking home from the library in the dark and thinking about bad guys in the bushes. We don't get real scared about shit like that, because we know in our heart of hearts that the blood tests will come back clean and there won't be any bad guys in the bushes. Why? Because stuff like that only happens to the people on TV. When I saw that big gray Mercedes, the only car in about an acre of empty parking lot, I got real scared for the first time since that thing in the boxing room with Skipper Brannigan. That time was the closest we ever came to really getting into it. So what do you think of this Dinky theory about real scared and TV scared?
Well, I think this is another powerful thing that King does often, where he almost never says like Joe heard a noise behind him and felt fear seize him. It's always a painting like this, where it's like details and situations and analogies that kind of push buttons in your head and make you imagine a fully textured situation, and then that kind of keys in the emotion that you want, that he wants in you specifically.
Sure.
Because we probably rarely feel real fear, and so if he says like he was terrified, it's like we don't really have the ability to summon that up at will. So he has to kind of paint the picture inside of our head. It's not a literal picture, it's an emotions picture. But I mean, that's the thing, is he's taking a fairly long paragraph here to make you understand that this is actually deeply frightening, and to make you feel that as well.
Yeah, and kind of once again going through his whole how Dinky's life is so sheltered, and his view of people is so sheltered because I think the actual truth behind his example of TV scared is actually sometimes the blood test does come back bad and you're sick and you're gonna die, right? And sometimes there is someone in the bushes, but like he's lived this, like, and I don't want to discount it, because I think Dinky has had a hard life, but like Skipper, he was just a bully. He was just like, there was a kid that was mean to him, and like that sucks, and it's not fair, and it's like one of the things you'll probably remember the rest of your life when it happens to you. But like, there's so many more people in this world that have much worse lives than that, you know? Yeah. But this is Dinky's viewpoint, is that that's the only thing he's ever experienced, and so it's the worst possible thing, and everything else is just kind of not real. Because yeah, that's the two times he was real scared was one time Skipper got mad at me, and then also I'm dealing with this scary Mercedes man. Yeah, right.
He just seems to have had almost no experiences. His life has just been so flat and
because monotonous. He's actually just an 11-year-old Bobby Garfield. He's not like it's so funny that he's 19, like he's an adult, but he doesn't act like it in almost any way.
Yeah, he just seems to have been, like, something at some point taught him that the world is scary and that he should just keep his head down. And he just successfully kept his head down for his entire life and never did anything.
Yep.
So what do you make of the similarity between Brannigan here in the name of Skipper Brannigan and the name Brodigan, who will obviously be someone that I think he meets relatively soon, probably?
I mean, realistically, entire coincidence. But in the world of the Dark Tower, yeah, totally. Exactly. Like there's this really interesting thing that the two most important people in his life will have names very similar to them. And like I was talking about earlier, like both Bobby and Dinky have had a person with a very similar name come into their lives and change them. Like Skipper sent him on this path, whether he meant to or not. I don't know how much older Skipper is supposed to be than him. Do you know?
I mean, he probably is like another 19-year-old is what I was kind of imagining. I mean, he might have been, 22 or something, which when you're 19 seems really old and mature, which is hilarious. But it's funny because you can kind of imagine the scene where he first is introduced to Ted Brodigan and Ted says his name and Dinky, hears Brannigan and he's like, and it's like this moment of like, you can almost write the scene in your head, of course that never actually happens, but it's interesting to think about.
So Dinky, of course, goes to meet with Sharpton because it's too tempting. And he's actually like thinking that he knows, and he needs to find out how much he knows about what he did to Skipper. And while he's doing that, he's kind of slowly revealing what Skipper did to him and what he did to Skipper. And I love this part here. I had a ponytail at work. You had to wear your hair in a ponytail if you had it long. Supermarket rules. And sometimes Skipper would come up behind me, grab the rubber band I used, and yank it out. Sometimes it would snarl in my hair and pull it. Sometimes it would break and snap against my neck. It got so I'd stick 2 or 3 extra rubber bands in my pants pocket before I left for work. I tried not to think about why I was doing it, what I was putting up with. If I did, I'd probably start hating myself, which you do hate yourself, Dinky. Like that's like you've already hate yourself. Like that's why you're doing all this. I'm 100% convinced that that's the case.
Yeah, he's hated himself for some time. And I mean, it's probably in some sense why they know they can get him to do this job, because a person who already hates themselves is just going to be piling more hate onto the pile if they start assassinating people. And he's already really good at kind of not noticing things.
Yeah. I mean, one of the most fun parts about rereading this story is realizing the ways in which the Trans Corporation has completely managed Dinky, like from the beginning. Like they're doing the exact right things, they're pulling the exact right chords, they're pushing the exact right buttons to lead him down this path where he says yes to this thing. And it's of course because they have psychics and superpowered people that are telling them what buttons to push and what chords to pull and all these things. And he's just been totally managed through this whole process. Speaking of which, this thing right here, I took a deep breath, held it, and then let it out and said, "This is Eventual." Mr. Sharpton laughed, his clean-shaven cheeks gleaming in the dashboard lights. He didn't ask what it meant. He knew. Everything's eventual, Dink. Or can be, for the right person. You think so? No, so. Not a shred of doubt in his voice. I just love that, right? Like the person who makes the line is actually Sharpton, who knows what eventual means already, because of course he does.
Yeah, no, that's great. It kind of inverts everything, right? It's I love it.
I love Sharpton. Like he's got his sword tie. Like actually Justin Long chose to do a really interesting voice for him. It wasn't the thing I imagined in my head when I read it, but I liked it. It was much more like sinister sounding. Like for a second there, I was like, wait, that's not Flag, is it? And I had to check his name again just to make sure, because like it kind of sounded Randall Flaggy a little bit. It's not, but
it's a sort of Flag-like character, though. I imagine.
Yeah. So Sharpton finally makes Dinky tell what happened to Skipper, and as he's doing it, we get this, and I think this is really important here, Matt. Mr. Sharpton reached over and put his hand on my arm. It was the kind of thing you'd expect to get from an old guy like him, sitting with him in his big German car in a deserted parking lot. But I knew when he touched me that it wasn't like that. He wasn't hitting on me. It was good to be touched the way he touched me. Until then, I didn't know how sad I was. Sometimes you don't because it's just, I don't know, all around. I put my head down. I didn't start bawling or anything, but the tears went running down my cheeks. The swords on his tie doubled, then tripled. 3 for 1. Such a deal. So, like we were talking about before, this is one of those moments that really made me feel Low Men in Yellow Coats.
Yeah. Yeah. He's very reminiscent of Bobby Garfield, you know, and we see why he's willing to go so far for this man who showed him this moment of kindness. And, you know, like we talked about before, the power of touch, just the affirmation of like, you know, you're a human being and I'm reaching out to touch you. And you know, we neither we nor Dinky really understood how miserable Dinky was until this moment of, you know, whether it's real or not, it's an appearance of compassion, and that's enough to really push him. So yeah, so it makes sense that at this point in the story, as he's telling the story anyway, that he'd be willing to jump through hoops for this guy.
Yeah. And of course, Dinky, like Bobby and like Stephen King himself, missing a father figure. No, I think Dinky's dad walked out on them, I think is what we were told. Again, just like Stephen King.
Yeah.
But I mean, he's desperate for this kind of companionship. He's desperate for touch. He's desperate for all these things. And like, it's so calculated, right? Like Sharpton knows exactly what he's doing here. He knows what that reaction is going to be. Like, you got to think he's, like we said, he's playing him this whole way. And this is, if you touch him on the arm like that, like a father, you know, trying to comfort a son, like, you got him. And he's right.
Yeah. Yep.
And the ominousness of it too. Like, I love the last line, the swords on his tie doubled, then tripled, because of the tears running down his eye are distorting his vision. Right. But it's like, yes, I got you. You know, like, I don't know. I love it.
Yeah, that's great.
So Dinky finally tells us about his special deal, Matt. He writes shapes, strange shapes like fouders, and infuses them with power to do things to people that he wants. When he's younger, he kills a group of flies, and then when he's a little bit older, he takes care of the annoying neighborhood dog. And it's this really interesting power that I don't think we've ever seen before in the King universe, right?
Yeah, it almost seems like magic, right? It's interesting because it's, I mean, clearly we're meant to fit it into the same bucket as the other psychic powers because he ends up being a breaker, but the manifestation is so interesting and unique. And, you know, you could imagine that he's doing like magic runes and he's sort of unconsciously doing magic, or maybe that is what magic is in this world, you know, is it's some mix of psychic and, you know, wizardry, it's fun to think about though.
And one of the constants of this book is relating how he does this to the act of creation, right? Like, he says the first time he's kind of explaining the trance he goes into when he's writing the chalk on the sidewalk in front of the dog is like a painter making their painting, or an artist writing a song. The one he doesn't say, or like an author, you know, writing a book. But this idea that, like, you know, that even King even prefaces at the beginning of this story of, you know, is this coming out of you? Is it coming from you, or is it just coming out of you? And that's the same thing happening here, where he just kind of goes into this creation trance and is drawing shapes and figures and words that are meaningless to him, that he doesn't know, that it's just this sheer act of creation. And I mean, you wonder, like, is there a good use of this power? Like, is his power, I'm going to kill people, or is he just, because of his experiences and because of what the Trans Corporation does to him, it turns it that way? I mean, I guess we know the answer to that is yes, because Dinky becomes a good character by the end of his story, right? He helps people. Yeah,
I don't remember the details, but I kind of figured that he could compel people to do pretty much wherever he wanted. Not just kill themselves. Like, it just, maybe I'm wrong there. I guess there's no textual proof of that, but it seemed more like a power to compel rather than just a power specifically to compel people to kill themselves.
Yeah. The idea that it's linked to creation and to creation of art specifically, I think is King kind of acknowledging that this thing he does and this thing so many artists around the world do is incredibly powerful, and it can be incredibly dangerous as well, which is really fascinating. I mean, it won't be the last time he deals with that kind of idea. I'm thinking of one of his novels, Duma Key, which kind of is about a painter specifically, and the things he unleashes via his painting is really interesting. This idea that like maybe like when you write a story like this that just flows out of you, that like, you know, you have one little kernel of an idea and suddenly this whole world that you've made up flows out of you like nothing. Maybe that's a little scary sometimes too. Like it's impressive, you're impressed with yourself, but gosh, that came out of me. I don't even remember doing all that. Like that's got to be a little bit scary too.
Yeah, it can be dangerous, and it can be dark, and it can be stuff that you don't recognize, even though it did come from you. So
yeah,
that's cool. I like the weird words that he uses for his symbols.
Yeah, I like this part. Let me read this so we can talk about that a little more. He's talking about the stuff on the sidewalk that remains for days afterwards. Which, first of all, like his it's so cruel the way, because the way the dog kills itself is by just wrapping itself around a tree enough times that it strangles itself to death.
Yeah,
which is not just, you know, kill yourself. It's like incredibly cruel what he's doing and not even really realizing it.
Yeah, it is kind of horrible. It is like you see why Dinky has this like pretty fucked up relationship with his power, where like he doesn't really think of it as his power, right? He's sort of scared of it. It's almost like this is one of the many things in the world that is scary. And you know, it's interesting, we kind of don't get to see the scene where he like decides that he's going to murder Skip. It's just kind of like he kind of reaches a breaking point. He sends him a letter, and then he feels horrible about it. So it's almost like it was a I don't want to absolve him too much of it, but like just the way it's written, it almost sounds like it was almost involuntary or something.
Well, I mean, that's kind of the way it goes, though, right? I mean, like when he kills the dog, it's not like he said, "Today I am going to kill this dog." It's that he woke up with this idea in his head, with this thought in his head, this thing, and he had to get it out. He rushed out to the sidewalk to get it out, and assumingly the same thing happens with Skipper, and the same thing happens with the 200 other people he kills over the course of the story. That like he's not even, when he's drawing the symbols, he's not even aware of who the person is yet. He just wakes up with this strong urge to do this thing, which again in a very Stephen King like way is immediately compared to waking up with a boner, because that's just, but I mean that's this relation back to sex again, and creation in a way, that this urge just comes on him, and he's not even kind of aware of what he's doing is really interesting, because where's that coming from? Because like it happens before he's programmed by Transcorp, so it's not like they implanted some trigger in him to trigger him to do this. It's coming from something else. It's coming from something older and deeper and primer.
yeah it's interesting. There definitely seems to be, if we're going to assume that King has something like a consistent idea of how he thinks about psychic powers across all of his stories, which honestly
no way.
Yeah, I'm like, honestly, why should he? But if we pretend for a second that he does, it doesn't seem like psychic powers are a good thing. Sounds like they can be, but it doesn't sound like there's anything intrinsically good about them. It could be, I think, as you're hinting, like they are something of the darkness, which it affects some people, and for those people, it's more a curse than it is a blessing.
Yeah, no, I think they're like universally bad in at least like for the everyday life of the person that has them. Like nobody in this world that gets any kind of psychic superpower has a good time with it. They don't get to live it up, and even if there is an instance of them living it up, it's almost immediately countered by terrible consequences of that particular thing.
I'm even thinking about Dreamcatcher, which is um, uh, different source of the powers, but you have the example of these handful of friends who all have psychic powers and they're all just totally miserable.
Yeah. I mean, it's isolating. That's what's so fascinating about the Breakers as a concept. And I don't know if you remember this specifically, but like Dinky was one of the ones when we first met the Breakers where they were kind of telling the deal of why these people were choosing to do this thing. Jake was absolutely horrified that anyone would choose to like behave this way, to knowingly end the universe, and he couldn't understand. And Dinky got very, very angry and defensive because Dinky is a person who absolutely understands. And I think one thing this story is doing for us is kind of laying the groundwork for why he would feel that way, why he would be so certain and so defensive about any mischaracterization of these people, because he was precisely one of them. And if not for, we'll get into this, but if not for the lack of technology, he would still possibly be doing this very thing he's doing right now.
Yeah.
So we went on a tangent there, but I want to talk about the sidewalk and what's left there. So we see, and while it was sharp, no one walked on it. I saw this for myself. People, kids walking to school, ladies walking downtown, Mr. Shermanhorn, the mailman, would just kind of veer around it. They didn't even know what they were doing, and nobody ever talked about it either. Like, what's up with that weird shit on the sidewalk? Or what do you suppose you call something like that? A founder, dim bulb. It was as if they didn't even see it. It was there, except part of them must. Why else would they have walked around it? So this is one of those things that I think is also this universal truism in King literature with otherworldly things, is that you can't see them, and that people know that they're there, but they choose not to see them. Like that we all exist with some certain awareness of things beyond our understanding, and yet don't choose not to look at it. I mean, this is we're told this specifically, that the low men avoid being seen this way. There's plenty of other instances of people just kind of looking away from the otherworldly stuff.
Yeah, there's it's funny. I'm kind of like halfway through finishing the rest of the Hearts in Atlantis short story collection, and there's other beats in there about people. In this particular instance that I'm thinking of, it's not even supernatural. It's just beats about people just not noticing things that don't concern them, and
or that they don't want to concern them, because to have it concern them would make their lives too complicated.
Exactly.
And I think that's what, like, we're once again using that genre conceit of actual superpower stuff to lay a universality of human behavior, which is that we choose not to see things we don't want to deal with.
Yeah. And I think also, I mean, honestly, there's kind of a general trope in a lot of fantasy and a lot of urban fantasy where it's like the uninitiated can't see the magic, and like unless you've been welcomed into the world of magic, you literally don't perceive it. That's it's a fun trope. I like it. So sure. I think maybe this counts as an implementation of that.
Yeah. So Sharpton tells Dinky how rare people are like him, really, really buttering him up and laying it on thick here, saying he's one of 8 million, that there's probably only 3,000 of them in the entire world, and that he works for a company called Trans Corporation that is going around and collecting these people and recruiting them to do, well, to make the skippers of the world pay for the things that they're doing. So this is when we have to talk about the Dark Tower connection a little bit here, right? Because if you will recall, we do learn eventually that Trans Corporation is actually a subdivision of North Central Positronics. So this is just part of the same machine that we've seen time and time and time again. But I do not, as we said at the beginning, I do not think that was the case when he came up with Trans Corporation. Because, as we said, Stephen King is not subtle. When he wants to make a direct Dark Tower reference, like in Low Men in Yellow Coats, he will just say the Crimson King. He will just say Roland Deschain or the Gunslinger. He will just say these things. if he wanted to make this a Dark Tower reference at the time, he would have just called it Sombra or North Central Positronics or something like that. I think this is just, that's not what he had in mind at the time.
Yeah, right. The closest I can get to arguing against that and saying that trans corporation sounds like a Dark Tower thing is like just the word trans makes you think about like transportation in the like between dimension sense.
Sure.
It's like this is a dimension hopping organization. But it's like, yeah, well, maybe he did have that in the back of his mind, but like you said, there's really nothing in this story that's explicitly Dark Tower a priori until you later until Dinky shows up in the Dark Tower, obviously.
Sure. Yeah. And just in case we were wondering if this Mr. Sharpton is a bad guy or not, they're called Trans Corporation, and so he uses an unfortunate slur against transgender people to call the people like Dinky. I'm not even going to repeat it because I don't like it, but I think it does. I'm trying to wonder if, because obviously right now in 2021 we hear that and go, ugh, this guy's bad, but I wonder in 1997 or in 2002 what the immediate reaction to that word would have been. I don't think it would have been as immediately off-put as it is now.
Yeah, well, I wouldn't have even known what it meant
sure
back then, and I was a teenager admittedly, but like I suspect that King was not aware of the association, but if he was probably...
I don't know about that. I think he was.
I guess I don't know how old that word is, but in any case, you're probably right, and he probably was using it in a way that was meant to like make you kind of raise an eyebrow at this Sharpton fella.
Yeah, I think so often King gets himself in trouble, and I say that kind of rolling my eyes because I think it's very clear here that like this is a bad guy and he's using this terrible word for bad reasons, and then that understandably upsets people, but I think that's the point here. I think that's the point. Just like there's over and over again where Dinky, like the first thing he asks Sharpton when he says, can we meet to talk about this job? The first thing he says is, are you queer? This is, these characters are off-putting intentionally. They're supposed to be this way.
Yeah, right. It's an intentional choice. Absolutely. Yeah. And I mean, and there's a certain way you could see Sharpton is sort of making fun of Dinky's lack of worldliness by calling him what Sharpton obviously is well, not obviously because we're not sure about this, but might be aware as an insult, and then having Dinky be like proud of it, and then Sharpton kind of laughing behind his hand at how stupid Dinky is. That was one thing that kind of crossed my mind. Like, the idea of like, or the trope in some movies of like people from another culture give somebody a nickname in their language, and they're like, oh, what does it mean? Oh, it means brave warrior, and it actually means something terrible. Like that kind of thing, and it's Sharpton just like disrespecting Dinky basically. Yeah, no, I think you're onto something there for sure. I think he's definitely having fun with this kid he perceives as stupid. But I mean, the weird thing about Dinky is he's not that stupid. He's just ignorant, like he just doesn't have any kind of world knowledge, but he's clever and he's able to like pick up on things eventually. He just doesn't have a lot of experience. Yeah, right. I do think that it's clear that Sharpton talks down to him though. So oh yeah. So that's part of that. Mm-hmm.
So having been sufficiently manipulated, Dinky, of course, accepts the job, and they whisk him away to the beautiful city of Peoria, his first plane ride ever, which is, of course, a private plane because they're putting out all the stops for him, only to then pay him $70 a week. Mm-hmm. I love this really interesting part where Dinky is almost immediately homesick, and here's another part that makes me think back to Low Men in Yellow Coats. Ma was the least of what I missed. You think it would have been close, as it was us against the world, in a manner of speaking, but my mother was never much for loving and comforting. She didn't whip on my head or put out her cigarettes in my armpits or anything like that. But so what? I mean, big whoop. I've never had any kids, so I guess I can't say for sure, but somehow I don't think being a great parent is about the stuff you didn't do to your rug monkeys.
Yeah, that sure seemed like a lot of single moms with misfit sons in King stories.
Yeah. I mean, I really find this, once again, we have a mother who is not very affectionate, not very loving, and we see the result of this on her son as he looks for it elsewhere and finds it in the first man willing to, pat him on the arm. Like I think like there's a lot of reasons why Dinky takes this job, and I really think the biggest one is Sharpton is just there for him. I mean, that's like the biggest refrain in the story is him calling up Sharpton and being like, and asking questions. And I wonder like how often this happens for Sharpton. Like he says, call me anytime, day or night, 3 a.m, whatever. How often do people take him up on that?
Yeah. I mean, I would guess not often.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
So Dinky feels like he's getting hypnotized and reprogrammed, and he calls Dr. Sharpton to complain about it, who assures him that it's probably all fine. And then a doctor finds him the next day and apologizes. So it's definitely okay, right?
It's all fine. Yeah. No.
Yeah.
I mean, yeah.
He just kind of, I mean, you see him go from I'm incredibly afraid that they're hypnotizing me to and sometimes if I'd feel dopey as if someone had put something in my mashed potatoes, or hyper, sometimes I feel that way too. And there were other times, at least 2, where I was pretty sure I'd been hypnotized again. But so what? I mean, was any of that a big deal after you've been chased around a supermarket parking lot by a maniac who was laughing and making race car noises and trying to run you over with a shopping cart? Yes, Dinky.
Yeah, right. This is more of that him trying to convince, either the reader or probably just trying to convince himself that it was totally reasonable that I didn't get any of this stuff and that I just went along with it for as long as I did, and that I'm only now, he's sort of he's very slowly working his head around everything to the point where he can actually grapple with the horrible stuff that he's done.
Yeah, for sure. And I love, and I don't want to minimize bullying at all, but I love the idea that like he's starting to his facade is starting to crumble a little bit, because like, yes, being hypnotized by an evil government organization is considerably worse than a bully chasing after you with a shopping cart. Like that's like, I understand like from a certain perspective, like that seems like the worst possible thing in the world, but come on.
Right.
Come on.
Yeah. I mean, in the case with the shopping cart, you can just like defend yourself, whereas there's no way you can defend yourself against an evil corporation that's trying to hypnotize you.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah.
So Dink passes training and moves into his house, still not sure exactly what he's supposed to be doing. But as we talked about, one day he just wakes up and knows. He goes to work on his little drawings and then sends them to someone via Dinky mail.
Mm-hmm.
Just another one of those delightful details of the story that just help enforce this tone that is one part like terrible and ominous and another part extremely silly. I kind of love it.
Yeah, everything is, the Dinky day board, the Dinky mail, it's all.
Yeah. I also love this part where after his first day of work, he calls up Sharpton and says he did it. He's working. And this part here, let's discuss something more important, Dink. How did it feel? Fucking wonderful. Good. Don't question wonder, Dink. Don't ever question wonder. And he hung up. I love that. I love that. Like, not only do I love that this Dinky admits that even now, even knowing what he was doing, this was the best day in his life. It gave him the best feeling. And just this idea of like, don't question that. Chase that high. Don't question that high. Keep chasing it.
Yeah, it's so dangerous. And it, again, one of those connections that is obvious from our perspective is that the breakers, it feels great to break, it feels amazing, feels satisfying to dig into the beam, even if you know what you're doing as you tear away at the beam that's holding up reality. It's this wonderful feeling.
Yeah, it's this feeling of purpose that you're finally getting to do the thing you were made to do. Like imagine if you were like really, really good at a sport, but you couldn't play the sport. Like
Mhm.
getting to play the sport and stretch your legs and do that thing that you feel like you were made to do has to be one of the best feelings in the world. And well, these people, this is what they were quote unquote made to do, or at least they feel that way.
Yeah, it kind of reminds me of some of the stuff that I said back when we were reading about the Dark Tower, how our main characters were at various times following this kind of holy, glorious sense of purpose and meaning that they were getting from either the rose or the beams or the tower, via dreams or via other methods. And sometimes I remember I was skeptical and I would be like, hey, like, lots of things feel great without actually being great. Like heroin, for example, in the case of Eddie. And so I just, I don't know if that skepticism ever directly came to anything other than the fact that for Roland specifically, the tower was a sort of booby prize that wasn't really what he wanted it to be at all, obviously. And the cost to get there was, way too high. So I don't know. I'm just kind of connecting these things together where King likes to play with the idea of people deciding to follow something because it just seems like this beautiful. It gives them this beautiful feeling of purpose and meaning, and it's like, yeah, totally. Well, that doesn't mean it's good.
Yeah. No, I like that a lot. So Dinky kind of continues on working over and over again, and we learn a little bit more about this work that, back in the ancient days of 1997 or 2002 or whenever the hell this book is supposed to take place, not everyone has email. Some people he has to send letters to convince them to kill themselves. And thusly, he knows the names of those people. And that kind of starts us down a path where one day he finds the names of one of the people in the newspaper. He sees Mr. Andrew Neff of the New York Post. And this is I kind of want to talk to you about this a little bit here, because let's talk about technology a little bit here, Matt.
Mm-hmm.
Because there's this undercurrent in this whole thing that, like, the three people he learns about that he killed that kind of send him out of this delusion that he's put himself in. The reason why we know about them is because they don't have email, because they refuse to embrace technology. They're outside the force of technology. And so in order to kill them, it has to be much more personal. It has to be much more focused. You have to actually learn their name and know a little bit about them before you send them the letter, as opposed to shooting off a dinky mail into the void where all you have is an email address that you don't even see. And I think King is making a comment about technology here for sure, right? This idea that technology builds the impersonal, and especially internet technology, and this idea that you take psychic powers and then add the coldness of technology, and suddenly Dinky kills 200 people, Matt, 200 people without ever knowing anything about them.
Yeah. I mean, it's just become more salient over time that, like, if people who are just being awful to others online, they don't really viscerally see those people as being people. Yeah. Whereas if you had to, for every snarky tweet, if you had to write it on paper and write somebody's real name on it and put a stamp on it and put it in the mailbox, you just never do that, right?
Yeah. We should make that mandatory. If you're going to have snark, it has to be snail mail.
Yeah.
It's the only thing.
We should start Twitter, but mail. Yeah. It's a good idea. This is $1 million idea.
Isn't it funny that used to be what mail was? Because that was the only way to communicate, where like a letter was just like, hey, what's up? How you been? Here's what happened to me today.
I guess that's kind of what a postcard is, because it's multimedia, right? It's got a picture and text.
Wow. Yeah. But we get this part as well, and I want to talk to you about this. It would be better in any case to just leave and come back tomorrow. Tomorrow, the picture of the guy with the pipe would be gone. Tomorrow, someone else's picture would be there on the lower right-hand corner of the page of page one. People always dying, right? People who aren't superstars or anything, just famous enough to get their pictures down there in the lower right corner of page one. And sometimes people were puzzled about it, the way folks back home in Harkinville had been puzzled about Skipper's death. No alcohol in his blood, clear night, dry road, not the suicidal type. The world is full of mysteries like that, though. And sometimes it's best not to solve them. Sometimes the solutions aren't, too eventual.
Mm-hmm.
I love this idea of, just like he's so trying to convince himself that that not to look, like the idea that the solutions to puzzles aren't eventual, which again is another play off that word, right? Is another, like, these are puzzles that if you don't solve them, no one will solve, right? That like
Mm-hmm.
that it's very easy to look away from things that aren't eventual
Yeah.
because they're not eventual.
Yeah. Just keep your head down, keep doing your job. And, maybe you've murdered hundreds of innocent people, but then again, maybe not. And if you don't look, then you never have to know. And
Yeah.
that's better from your point of view, right?
Of course, Dinky has forgotten, Matt, that everything is eventual.
Everything is eventual. Yep.
So you can keep your head down, you can choose not to look, but eventually you won't be able to ignore it.
Yeah, right. That's I think that's the coded reference there. Yeah, definitely.
On top of the lack of embracing technology, I think there is something interesting here that we learn about what these people are doing. Dinky was told that these were bad guys, but these three people we learn that Mr. Neff is a very outspoken liberal member of a very conservative newspaper. We learn that one is a former general who, after seeing the horrors of war, became anti-war. We see an AIDS researcher who was not just researching AIDS on her own, but she was facilitating, which is a charged word, other AIDS research. That it wasn't just how successful her research would be, is that she was linking people together. And so what does that tell us about Transcorp and what they're wanting to do?
Well, it seems like their targets are people who are devoted to helping others through fostering cooperation and communication. And so what they're doing, therefore, is they're dividing everyone. They're breaking ties. They're fostering, conflict.
Yeah,
quite simply put.
So I guess the question is, once again, what does this have to do with the mission and the beam? Like, if you're Transcorp, aka Sombra, aka North Central Positronics, why are you not just bringing Dinky to Algolciento right now and starting him on that work? Like, why? What is this work, and why does it matter to you?
I don't know. I mean, maybe. One thought that comes to me is just like the ability to just assassinate people at a distance is pretty specific and pretty powerful. And so maybe, for most breakers, for most psychics, they would just take them to Algolciento.
Sure.
But in his particular case, they're like, hey, he's actually really useful in this specific purpose. We have these specific people who are maybe explicitly, maybe more metaphorically agents of the white. And the bad guys have just been tasked with tearing them down. And I don't really know that I understand what the Crimson King wants. Like, is he really monomaniacally focused on breaking the beams, or is that just like one of his projects and he has a whole bunch of other areas of interest which involve making sure that everyone is miserable all the time everywhere, on the way to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think I really like your sentence about coordination and communication, and like this idea that like any kind of resistance that could be put against anything they're trying to do, we need to squash that down by by eliminating the people that could form a quartet, right? Like let's get rid of all the Dins on this level of the tower, and so there can be no quartet, there can be no resistance, there can be no gunslingers, because everyone that could have been that or could have become that by experiencing someone else teach them that is being eliminated. So again, like this is all speculation, because Transcorp had nothing to do with North Central Positronics when he wrote this story. It's just a perfect stand-in for a government organization that is trying to prevent progress because they like being in power. Like that's a perfect stand-in for that, and it doesn't have to. But because we know this is a Dark Tower connection, we have to at least try to figure out how to slot it in our expanding universe.
Yeah, that's the fun thing, is we always get to interpret everything two different ways, like as it would appear to a reader at the time, and then as it appears to us with all of this additional later context.
Yeah. I really love this moment where Dinky starts putting everything together, and he realizes that he's killed over 200 people, and I love when characters take responsibility for themselves. That's like my thing, you know?
Mhm.
So I love this moment where, like, yeah, Transcorp tricked me and they hypnotized me, but he can't lie to himself anymore. And he has to admit that, like, he was doing this because it made him feel good. It made him feel important. And it, like, literally made him feel good. It was kind of like a drug in and of itself. And so I just love this, like, here now, as we're reaching the end of this epistolary thing, he's finally, like, admitting his own culpability in this thing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's great. You know, it's I think just speaking about Dinky in general, and how we see him here versus how we see him in the Dark Tower, this is one of those instances where I do absolutely see the character continuity. He absolutely feels like the same guy that we meet in the Dark Tower, and he feels like he's on part of the same character journey, actually.
Yeah, and I think his defensiveness of the other breakers is not because he's excusing their actions, but rather just because he understands them, and he doesn't want someone to come in and look at them and only see the horrible side. Like, yes, what we're doing is bad. I will not shy away from that, but you got to understand what it's like to be us.
Mm-hmm.
It's nothing you've ever experienced in your life, Jake. And Jake is this really fascinating, unique case because he does have a little bit of what Dinky has. But he also was kind of plucked from an existence that would have turned him into a Dinky by his amazing father figure, Roland Deschain, not a terrible father figure like Sharpton, who genuinely loves him and genuinely wants to care for him. And yes, okay, drops him down a mountain, but like,
and maybe gets him killed twice. But
look, he got to do it. That's fine.
And then I mean, didn't do too much better the second time around, if we're honest.
Okay,
you know,
bad example. But the point is, I do think from a certain point of view, Jake's life is much different than any other breakers ever would have been. And I do think, like, we got to see a little bit about Jake and what his future could possibly hold, this resentment towards both his parental figures, like this ostracization he felt. I think he would have not necessarily been a Dinky Earnshaw, but been someone who you could see amongst those group of breakers.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I just got totally sniped in the head by the like some sort of next level of the tower or whatever, where I almost said next turning of the wheel, because
too much wheel of time
on the brain, where like Roland picks up Bobby Garfield and Ted Brodigan goes to Jake Chambers' house, and
wow,
so because I don't know, it's very fun to imagine, because they're very different, even though they're both 11-year-old boys. They're both very different characters, and it'd be interesting to think about the similarities and differences in how those two situations would play out.
Yeah, gosh, the next Do the King thing, someone write that. I can't even think of all the implications of how that would play out, but that's a fun exercise for sure.
Yeah, right. It's very under constrained. You could take it in all kinds of directions. Mm-hmm. And now I'm going to have a hard time focusing because I'm thinking about that.
All right, we're almost done here, Matt.
Okay,
let's focus up, and then we can play that game.
Okay.
I really love, speaking of his full realization, I love this part here. There was other stuff to think about too, like how you could hypnotize a talented guy or drug him, or maybe even expose him to other talented guys in order to keep him from asking any of the wrong questions or doing any of the wrong things. Like how you could make sure such a talented guy couldn't run away even if he hadn't happened to wake up on the truth. You do that by setting him up in what was essentially a cashless existence, a life where rule number one was no rat holing any extra dough, not even pocket change. What sort of talented guy would fall for something like that? A naive one with few friends and next to no self-image, a guy who would sell you his talented soul for a few groceries and $70 a week because he believes that's about what it's worth. I love that. And that's like, you almost, and I mean, I guess you could maybe argue this isn't perfect writing, because I think Dinky's voice goes away here and something else comes out. I think that the voice of the tone of the jokey, semi-sarcastic bunch of saying Dinky disappears in that paragraph I just read. And one person could say, well, it's because King is like stating his theme, and so he wants to state it clearly. But I just think, I think part of that stuff was an affect. There's nothing textually to that, but I think the way Dinky talks and the way Dinky shrugs off stuff and has his sayings and like is like, oh, it's all eventual. Like I feel like that's protection in a lot of ways.
Yeah.
And this is him being fully exposed. And so the tone of the way he writes changes.
Yeah, I think he's being jokey so that he can brush this stuff off. And
and
now he's being serious. And I mean, I don't know. Like I've written journals at various times, and like sometimes I can write in the journal in a very colloquial style where it's like I'm talking to a person in a lighthearted way, and then sometimes it's like if it's serious, it's like you take on a totally different tone. It's like you're taking on a different voice, although you're not thinking about it that way because you're not writing fiction. I don't know. I see what you mean. I think it works absolutely, and it's just a sign that it's like he's dropping the frivolous like desire to push it away, and he's being serious for the first time.
Yeah, and to be clear here, I'm not saying this is bad writing at all.
Yeah.
I just, as I was saying this is wonderful, I could see the person in the back of my head saying, "Oh, but is maybe that's not good." And I was just preemptively saying that person was wrong as I was saying why this is good.
Yeah, I mean, another way of seeing it is just like you identified a change, and it's interesting to consider what is the rationale behind the change. And I think
I mean, if there's one universal thing that I could instill upon people in this world, it's don't make your first reaction to something be your final conclusion on it. Like this is the mantra we've kind of been saying for years, this idea that like if you read something and you don't like it, or you read something and you think, oh, that's weird, isn't it so much more interesting to say, okay, maybe they did that on purpose, and maybe I shouldn't say, oh, this is bad writing. Oh, maybe it's actually good writing. You just weren't looking at it from the right angle.
Yeah.
Which is not to say there's no such thing as bad writing. Obviously there is, but it's so much more fun to digest stuff this way.
Yeah. I mean, you're more likely to just miss things if you just assume that there's no gold buried in the haystack than if you assume there is gold buried in the haystack.
Yeah, because I mean, some people talk about like in Low Many Yellow Coats. I was actually just listening to our friends over at Losers Club, and they talked about how they didn't like when the story suddenly, without warning, jumps to Carol's point of view for just like the one time. And we had a whole like 10-minute conversation about how, no, that was good actually, because it was this long con to set up this moment where we think we're in her head again, but we're actually just in Superpower Bobby's head. And I don't know, like everyone has different reactions to those things, but like it's just that jumped out at me because I was just listening to them talk about that. And it's fun. It's fun. I don't know.
Yeah, well, yeah, absolutely. It's always, I don't know. I definitely agree. It's always, it's way more fun to think about, why does this work than like, this doesn't work.
Yeah.
I don't know.
I mean, the worst thing that happens is you end up really, really liking something that isn't very good.
Yeah.
And I'm fine with that.
Yeah, me too.
So, I really love, so Dinky heads home and starts writing the thing that we're reading right now. And as we've been talking about the whole time, we realized that at the beginning, Dinky was trying to be very defensive and trying to explain away what he's been doing, but he just can't anymore. And then we get to this part though. And of course, I'm still doing it. Yes. I thought at first I wouldn't be able to, no more than the kids in Mary Poppins could keep floating around the house when they lost their happy thoughts, but I could. And once I sat down in front of the computer screen and that river of fire started to flow, I was lost. You see, at least I think you do, this is what I was put on planet Earth for. Can I be blamed for doing the thing that finishes me off, that completes me? Answer: yes, Absolutely. So just really, really great here. I mean, it's so much in this one little paragraph.
Yeah. I mean, the number one thing that you notice about this whole story, really, but it's very sharply stated here, is how much addiction is the theme in this story, because he has no real meaning in his life. This is the one thing that gives him meaning, or makes him feel good, and so he's gonna do it. He's gonna. It doesn't matter how much it sucks, how much it's destroying him, how much he knows it's the wrong thing. It's what he's been put on planet Earth to do, and it's the second time that he basically says that much, that he uses the phrase planet Earth. Yeah.
To break is divine, man. That's what they say.
Mm-hmm.
And I will note once again, we have sex imagery here, right? Can I be blamed for doing the thing that finishes me off, that completes me?
Mm-hmm.
This is once again him tying this back to intercourse in a really fascinating way, that it's just peppered throughout this idea that we're connecting this power that he has and this thing that he does. From the very first moment, we connected that with sex. Like with the thing with the dog was connected to him waking up with a boner. That now the doing this is connected to having an orgasm, like finishing it. Like it's all very tightly connected in a character who has himself stated that he really doesn't have that much interest in sex because it's not eventual. And I don't know. I don't even know how to fully process that.
Yeah.
Other than, man, this guy is an incel, keeps popping up.
Well, I think for me, it's just as simple as this has replaced sex for him. Like,
sure.
Like he has some amount of sex drive, but like, this is what he wants to do. This is more meaningful, more feels better. It's taking up the whole slot in his brain that kind of, in some sense, should be occupied by a healthy sense of sexuality.
Yeah. No, I think you're right. So things might have continued on like this into perpetuity, but one day Dinky gets a message in the mail asking if he wants out. And he does want out, of course. And we get this. I could write more. Things have started to happen, and I believe that soon they'll be happening fast, but I don't think it would be safe. Up to now, I've just talked about myself. If I went any further, I'd talk about other people. So what do you think's going on here, Matt?
Well, there's a couple possibilities. Number one possibility, some group of good guys, some band of heroes have contacted Dinky Earnshaw, and they're trying to bust him out and enlist him into their quartet, which is not something we ever hear about, which leads me to point two. More likely possibility that this is either some kind of honeypot trap laid out by the bad guys to test Dinky's loyalty, where maybe they psychically detected that he's starting to have doubts, and so they send him this letter, and the letter is meant to test, like, if he goes for the letter, then we know he's unreliable, he fails the test, and we can't use him as an assassin anymore, and we'll just send him to Blue Heaven and use him as a breaker, which is what happens. So.
Yeah. I think that's fair, that this is all one big trap. I mean, the thing we do see at the end is that he decides he has one final letter send to Mr. Sharpton with the word Excalibur written on it, because I don't think we said this, but all these letters need some personal connection to the person for them to work. And so with connection to his tie, Excalibur. And we actually know, Matt, thanks to Dark Tower Book 7, that Dinky is successful in this, that he does kill Mr. Sharpton, because there's a throwaway line from, I think when we're in Pimley's head of he got in major trouble for killing his former boss. So he does manage to kill Mr. Sharpton.
And, the mention of Excalibur is connected to the Dark Tower as much as anything, because
that's true.
Roland is our Arthurian knight, and his guns are compared to literally Excalibur. So
Yep.
Which I mean, to make that more explicit, you could imagine the reason why Sharpton is obsessed with swords and with Excalibur and so forth is because he has this kind of romanticized notion of the gunslinger, because he's also like one of these people who's obsessed with all the midworld imagery. Not that he thinks Roland is great, but that he still has some like admiration for him, maybe, or for the gunslingers in abstract, perhaps.
Sure. Yeah, you wonder in a world where Transcorp is part of the Crimson King and North Central Positronics and all that stuff, how much Sharpton was aware of what was going on.
Mm-hmm.
Was he just a worker bee happily fulfilling his role, thinking, fooling himself in much the same way Dinky was fooling himself, or was he much more aware of the whole plan here? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a good point. We don't know, but he's dead now, so
he is dead. I think the final thing I want to talk about here is something that, like, the reason why I think it's important to read this story around the Dark Tower. It doesn't have to be before the Dark Tower, but around the Dark Tower. Because when we meet Dinky Earnshaw in the Dark Tower, we meet him as a person who is very defensive of the Breakers and very understanding of what they're going through, yes, but is also willing to help. And we see that kind of the reason why all this stuff got kicked into motion is because Shimi is put in he's brought to Algol Siento and is like having a nightmare or an episode in his bed, and Dinky hears him and goes in there to see if he's okay. And this is something that Ted Brodigan points out to us, like really putting a lot of emphasis on the fact that like nobody else would have done this.
Mm-hmm.
And I think one of the really important things here is that the Dinky in this story, at least at the beginning of the story, would not have done that. The Dinky at the beginning of the story is a loner, is a person who doesn't know how to reach out to people, doesn't know how to form friendships and connections, and is just kind of existing on his own, aloof and arrested. And so it becomes this kind of beautiful conclusion to his story that whatever has happened to him from this point forward has turned him in a person who will walk by a door, see a person suffering or hear a person suffering, and go in there and make sure they're okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's awesome. I love it.
I had forgotten about that particular detail, but that does make you happy. It makes you realize that like this character goes on to have a positive arc. This is not one of the, this can kind of be viewed as a downer ending, especially if you take the perspective that, I mean, we know that he doesn't actually escape here. But in the end, he does escape, and right? He doesn't get killed in the final battle, does he?
God, good. No, he survives. He survives.
That's what I thought.
I don't know. I don't remember where he goes, but he survives.
Yeah, I don't either.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. That's interesting. It's a downer ending based on what we know of the Dark Tower, but if you were just reading this short story on its own, the assumption would be that he would have gotten out, right?
That's true. Yeah. So I guess if you know nothing else, you would assume that he's broken out by some cadre of other psychics, some psychic resistance that we never in fact hear about. But it's a fun idea in any case.
Yeah, definitely. All right, Matt. That is Everything's Eventual. Short little story that was a lot of fun to read, I think.
Yeah, definitely.
All right, you want to read this month's or this week's discussion question?
Sure. This week's discussion question is, what is your favorite interesting minor psychic power?
Yeah, so Dinky's has a power we don't quite see very often in the whole psychic power thing. I think we've had a question like this, similar to this before, but I don't know. Okay, who cares? We're like 100 episodes in, so.
Yeah, surely there's something that distinguishes this question from whatever it was that we said before.
There might not be, and you know what? I don't care, because there's different listeners than there was then, and so different people will answer differently, and that's okay.
There you go. Thank you for justifying it.
Yeah. So that's going to do it for us this week. Next week on Kingslingers, it's a new book week once again. We're beginning our next novel in our season 2 journey, The Eyes of the Dragon. Oh boy, Matt. I don't think you remember why we're doing this one either, do you?
I don't. I mean, I know that it's a midworld story.
Okay.
That's all I know.
Yeah. So we're going to be reading the first 24 chapters of The Eyes of the Dragon. This book, like a lot of Stephen King's early books, have very, very short chapters. I think this book has over like 100 chapters, and some of them are only like a couple minutes long, reading time wise. So there's going to be a lot of chapter numbers, but the first 24, it still works out to about the same as length as everything else we read each week. So make sure you get a copy of The Eyes of the Dragon and start reading. Matt, good news. The audiobook is read by Bronson Pinchot, who we were just talking about last week. So enjoy that.
Awesome. Can't wait. That's going to be so fun. So remember, you can reach out to us via email at kingslingerspod@gmail.com or on Twitter at kingslingerspod. And the subreddit at r/doofmedia is also a great place to hang out and answer the question as well.
Absolutely. And if you are not already subscribed to this podcast, we strongly recommend you do so to make sure you never miss a single episode. It's new book week next week. It's very exciting. Christmas is coming. You're going to be really busy and you don't want to miss an episode. So subscribe and then you don't have to think about it. It's just there for you to press play on.
That's right. It's so easy. It's just like writing those letters that you write and you put in the mail. Mm-hmm. And maybe they kill somebody. Maybe not. You don't know.
Maybe they make them listen to this podcast.
Yeah, exactly. But in either case, if you like listening to the show and you want to support it, then please consider donating to patreon.com/doofmedia. This week we have to thank Julianne Z and certainly Cheryl. Welcome to the Patreon. We hope you enjoy the cool stuff we have over on the various reward tiers.
Absolutely. But if you cannot afford to donate right now, that is absolutely okay. You can help us out by sending a special letter to all of your loved ones that orders them to listen to this podcast with some funny shapes and circles and maybe some personalized information about them.
Yeah.
This week's Spotlight review comes from Washingtonian, who gives us 5 stars and says, "This is the podcast you've been looking for. This is hands down the best Stephen King related podcast I've ever listened to. I'm a big fan of podcasts and I listen to a lot of them from all different genres, and this one quickly became my favorite. Scott and Matt have a very effective dynamic. They communicate their thoughts and ideas very effectively. They often touch on thoughts I have on certain parts of the stories, and more often than not find things I would never have noticed. They're also very positive and are actually fans of King and stories in general, and it's a very fun and engaging point of view to listen to. I am a fan of King. I'm a pretty big fan."
Yeah, I think it's safe to say that I am now too. And honestly, I feel like if I wasn't, then I probably at some point would have been like, "Hey, Scott, I don't know if we should be covering Stephen King anymore."
Yeah, I don't think you're good enough of an actor to like fake the excitement, and
I'm not.
I'm not either, for the record.
Yeah, so thank you for your comments, Washingtonian. That's how my parents say that word. I don't know why that is. I don't know how the accent got lost, but that's very, very funny to me.
Yes, thank you so much. And thanks to everyone who has taken the time to send those ratings and reviews. And that's going to do it for us at last. Next week, we will see you right back here to begin some Dragon Eyes. Ooh, Dragon Eyes.
Yeah.
Long days and pleasant nights.
And may you have twice the number.
I can't say anything about the book, Matt, because you don't know anything about it. So all I can do is play with the title, and that's all I got.
Say the title in a spooky voice.
Eyes. The dragon. Dragons in Midworld have eyes. You know.
We know that. We've seen one dragon before, or a story about a dragon.
Yeah.
There's a story within a story. Whatever.